Hello and welcome from the University College London here in the United Kingdom. We're pleased to welcome people from all over the world who've joined us today to take part in an important conversation about progressive MS. My name's Stuart Nixon, and I've been a volunteer in the MS Society here in the UK for over 20 years, and have had the opportunity to play a role in developing and introducing services which have had beneficial effects for thousands of people affected by MS. And I'm passionate about MS research, and I serve as co-chair on the United Kingdom MS Society Research Strategy Committee. I've also lived with progressive MS for over 30 years, and I've had the pleasure to be here and share in the hope and progress being made for people with progressive multiple sclerosis. This webcast is part of an ongoing commitment to the International Progressive MS Alliance to share in the story of how the Alliance is bringing the world together to solve progressive MS. As we start today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment just to recognise the support that has been helping this webcast possible. We're grateful for sponsorship from Novartis and grant support from Genentech, part of the Roche Group. Today, we will cover the progress achieved in MS research, including the recent approval of 2 treatments for active progressive MS in the United States. These approvals now mean that there are 3 treatments available in some parts of the world for progressive forms of the condition. As we move through the session, we'll also look at what's on the horizon in terms of research and treatment, and importantly, what the Progressive MS Alliance is doing to accelerate solutions for all of us living with progressive MS. If you're watching this webcast, you likely know that ending progressive multiple sclerosis is both an urgent and unmet need. Worldwide, over 2.3 million people live with MS, a complex degenerative neurological condition which attacks both the brain and the spinal cord. And those people with progressive MS can face enormous uncertainty, losing ground each day as they experience worsening symptoms. And these don't just give them problems day to day. They take their plans, they remove the goals that people make to live their lives. Now, as many of us with progressive MS, we have more than just hope. We are now seeing real progress. Recent scientific advances include the emergence of the first therapies for progressive disease and the continued work of the International Progressive MS Alliance, which is fueling research to develop new breakthrough treatments. The Alliance is an unprecedented global collaboration of MS organisations, researchers, health professionals, pharmaceutical industry, trusts, foundations, donors and people living with progressive MS, all working together to address the unmet needs of those with this progressive condition. Rallying the global community to find solutions. In short, the Alliance has gathered together the brightest and best minds in MS to solve this problem. To date, the Alliance has invested over 23 million euros in funding 25 research projects, including the funding of 3 multinational collaborative research networks, and held a number of scientific meetings, bringing together leading MS experts to provide both perspective and set strategy for their work. Investments by the Alliance continued with commitments to invest over 60 million euros by 2025, and the collection of MS organisations that make up the Alliance have dedicated more than 124 million euros to progressive MS research. This is an extremely exciting time, and we all share in that. The advances of the early therapies over the past 2 years have been very important, but we know that these will only be effective for some. More must be done to ensure that everyone can access effective treatment. Today, I'm pleased to welcome a distinguished panel to share their insights on the state of progressive MS treatment and what the future holds. So firstly, I'll be introducing Professor Alan Thompson. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Brain Sciences at the University College London. His main area of expertise is in diagnosis, evaluation and management of the progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. He also serves as chair of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Progressive MS Alliance. Welcome to you, Professor. We're also joined today by Professor Giancarlo Comi. He's the chairman of the Department of Clinical Neurophysiology and director of the Institute of Experimental Neurology at the Scientific Institute, San Raffaele, Milan, Italy. Excuse me. He's also a leading expert in multiple sclerosis and serves as vice chairman of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Alliance. And concluding our group today is Professor Jenny Freeman. Jenny is Professor of Physiotherapy and Rehabilitation within the Faculty of Health and Human Sciences at Plymouth University here in the UK. Her research focuses on complex rehabilitation in MS and a key focus on keeping people as physically active as possible. She serves as a lead in the Progressive MS Alliance's Wellbeing Strategy Implementation team. So if I could come to Professor Thompson first. So we're all on the same page. Could you just give us a brief outline of what progressive MS means to you?
Certainly, Stuart. Most people, when they think of multiple sclerosis, they think of relapsing remitting MS, where you have attacks from which you recover. But there's a sizable proportion of people with MS whose deterioration is completely independent of relapses. In some, this is right from the very beginning of the condition, and we call those as having primary progressive MS. But for others, this progression follows 10 to 15 years of a relapsing remitting form, and we call those secondary progressive MS.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. And what we've managed to do is develop over a dozen drugs for relapsing and remitting MS. And yet, unfortunately, it's proved an awful lot harder to find those same treatments for progression. Could you just help us understand why that might be?
Yeah, well, I think it's great. We have over a dozen treatments for relapsing remitting MS in a relatively short period of time. And I mean, that's really focusing on the inflammatory form of the condition. Progression and progressive MS has been much more challenging, and one of the reasons for that is that inflammation does not play such a major role, and it's really about targeting neurodegeneration. And neurodegeneration is much more challenging. We can think about neuroprotection and repair, but these are really difficult things to actually deliver treatments on. And therefore we need many, many more treatments at the very early stages so that we can then bring them through the pipeline and to the patient. And this is really what the Alliance has been working on doing, focusing on the mechanisms that underlying progression, focusing on neurodegeneration, and looking to see if we can identify mechanisms and therefore treatments for progressive MS.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And despite these challenges, we are seeing progress. I think it's really interesting that over the last 2 years, a treatment for primary progressive MS has been approved in several parts of the world. And then in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the licensing of 2 drugs in the United States, an enormous step forward. Could you just introduce those drugs to us?
Sure. I mean, this is, as you say, a great step forward to have treatments for progressive MS. It is no longer an untreatable condition, and there are treatments available for some people with progressive MS. You mentioned in primary progressive MS, and we have a drug called ocrelizumab or Ocrevus, which actually targets B lymphocytes, a form of inflammatory cell. And this agent is available now for relapsing remitting MS and for primary progressive MS, which is really good in many parts of the world, though of course not all. And for secondary progressive MS, we've just had two agents which have been licensed by the FDA. The first is Maycent, or siponimod, which again works on the immune system. It's an immune modulating drug. It sweeps up the lymphocytes, takes them out of harm's way, and stops them doing harm. And the FDA have approved this agent, siponimod, for clinically isolated syndromes, relapsing remitting MS, and active secondary progressive MS. And I'll come back to active secondary progressive MS in a moment. The third agent is Mavenclad, or cladribine, an agent, a drug that's been actually around for quite some time. Again, it targets immune cells, particularly T and B lymphocytes. And that, in the States, it has been licensed for relapsing forms of MS, and that's including relapsing remitting MS and active secondary progressive MS. So that is, as I say, wonderful news. But I just would focus on what we mean by active secondary progressive MS. And this is really that group of patients that still have a lot of inflammatory activity. So they still have either relapses, as well as their progression, or they have new areas of abnormality on their MRI scans. So that's active, and that probably is maybe a third of patients with secondary progressive MS. It does mean that for 2/3 of patients with secondary progressive MS who are progressing but don't have this inflammatory activity, there is still no treatment available for them.
Sure. Thank you for helping us understand and talking through that. I guess one of the questions that is on everybody's lips with this is how effective do you see these drugs as being going forward?
Well, the trial results for all three is somewhat similar. So we're seeing a 20 to 25% effect on activity, on relapses, on imaging, which I think is real. Is probably stronger for those that have more active disease, but it is altogether modest, I think is the term I would use. So again, as you mentioned earlier, it does mean we have to maintain the focus on further new treatments, and particularly those that affect progression itself rather than this inflammatory activity.
Sure. I guess one of the issues there is around, have we actually changed? Are we actually looking at different aspects of the drug, of the condition, or are we actually looking at still looking at the inflammatory phase rather than maybe being able to look at other issues which cause progression?
It's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question, because the relationship between inflammation, which these drugs do target, and neurodegeneration, which is really what we want to target with progressive MS, is a complex one. I think, though, we would most likely say that this is primarily focusing on the inflammatory phase of the condition, on the inflammatory activity in secondary progressive MS, and we still desperately need treatments that are going to target the neurodegenerative phase of the condition.
Sure. Thank you. And I think that brings me into my next question, which is about, what do you see as the next set of drugs that are out there? Those drugs on the horizon that we're exploring at the moment.
Well, we have several, not a huge number, but there's a trial of simvastatin. A study was done, an early study was done in the United Kingdom, which showed that simvastatin may be beneficial in progressive MS, and we're now starting a major phase 3 trial, a definitive trial, which will be really interesting and important. There's another agent, an interesting agent called biotin, which again has been shown to be positive in smaller, earlier trials, and is now going to have a major phase 3 trial. It's now ongoing. It will be complete in about a year, 18 months. And there's another agent called masinib, which again has shown interesting results earlier on. It's now in a phase 3 trial, which is the definitive trial, and I think we'll have results from that actually later this year.
Super. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Alan. And what I'd like to do now is just move across to Professor Comey. There is still lots and lots more to do to ensure that everybody has effective access to treatment. And that's been one of the main impetus for creating the Progressive MS Alliance, so that we can accelerate the development of new and effective treatments. Could you tell us a little bit about the three priorities that the Alliance is using to address issues?
Well, as Alan said, we are not at the end, but the beginning of the history of treatment progressive MS. We are more or less in the same condition we have been 20 years ago for relapsing MS. And the reason is that, as Alan said, the mechanisms that are active in the progressive phase of the disease are largely different than those that are present in relapsing MS. So most of the problems occur inside the brain and the spinal cord. Yeah. So we need to use other approaches. Yeah. And this is exactly one of the key points that has been seen by the Alliance as a priority. So we need first to understand these mechanisms that are operating in the central nervous system. Understanding progression is fundamental, because if we don't know the enemy, we cannot know which type of approach to use. And the second point is that usually we spend about 10 years from the time we have on the table of our lab a potential treatment and the time that the drug is available for the person affected by MS. That's too much. So we really need to accelerate the process. And to accelerate the process, we need from one side to have a better design of the clinical trials, shorter. And from the other side, we need to have a better way to evaluate the drug, so better biomarkers, better tests to understand very soon if the drug is doing what we expect it has to do. These are the two key areas that we have to deal with. And the third one is the consideration that patients affected by the progressive phase of the disease, they have symptoms, they have problems. And we have to take into consideration these problems. Of course, there is already a lot of possibilities to deal with the symptomatic treatment, to perform a rehabilitation intervention, but we need to do more. Some problems like fatigue, cognitive problems, they have to be in some way treated better than we are able to do today. So I think that these three areas were the results of a quite long internal discussion where patients organization, industries, and of course experts from different continents were discussing together, trying to have this final decision.
Certainly. So could we just have a look through and unpick some of that? So if you could just help us looking at the first priority there and spend a little more time talking about understanding progression, understanding what the Alliance is doing to look specifically at progression. I understand that the Alliance currently has two large international collaborative research networks looking at drug development and understanding progression. It would be really useful if you could just tell us a little bit more about how they're working and what they're hoping to bring forward for us.
Sure. Of course, the real aim of the global effort of the Alliance is to come up with a new treatment for the patient. That's absolutely true. So to do that, we need to understand quite carefully about these mechanisms that are operating inside the central nervous system. The first network is coordinated by Gianvito Martino from Italy, with the involvement of many different countries, France, Germany, United States, Canada. Again, when we mentioned all these countries, immediately it came to our mind how the integration of the competencies are really fundamental. And this is the quality of these networks, because they really try to benefit from all the knowledge that is present in different labs. What is the peculiarity of this first network is the fact that they try to understand better with a very original approach that I will tell about in a minute. They want to know better which are the internal mechanisms in the brain and spinal cord that are really determining this special type of damage that results in the accumulation of progressive disability. And there are cells in our central nervous system that are involved in this process. Some are cells that are controlling the immune reactions, they are called microglia, and some others, they have quite strong interaction with the neurons, they are called astrocytes. They support trophically these neurons, they serve the neurons for their activity. So this network is concentrated on this population, and also they are concentrating on the cells that produce the myelin. We know MS is a myelin disease. So they are really interested to understand how to protect the myelin, how to help to reform the myelin when the myelin is lost. What is very original in the activity of this network is the fact that to test the efficacy of these potential new treatments, they use cells that are taken from the skin of the patient. So in our skin, we have cells that are stem cells. And these stem cells, in appropriate conditions, they may become neurons, they may become astrocytes, so they can become the different type of cells that are present in our brain. So in this way, you may directly test if the drug in that specific cell of that specific pathology is really doing something. That's the very original approach of this group. The second network is coordinated by Francisco Quintana. Again, it's a bit international effort because, again, Canada, United States, and also contribution from Israel is there. Plus, there is also some interaction with Sanofi Genzyme, a pharma company. The aim of this project is to understand much deeply which are the interactions between astrocytes and microglia, these cells that I just mentioned before, with the nerve fibers, and how they may be the target of the intervention. The reason is, as I said before, that most of the damage that takes place in the brain and spinal cord in this phase of the disease is due to this abnormal functioning of these cells. So they are trying to discover which are the type of messages that are exchanged among these cells and how these cells can be manipulated in order to produce a much better protection from this damage and to solve such a problem. Again, it's a very active group. They have already produced interesting results. They have already candidates. In the previous network that I mentioned, the Martino, they come up already with 73 potential markers. Here we have already some that even are also in a more advanced phase of validation. So we already know that they are doing something that is very interesting.
Super. I think that is really interesting, and it talks very strongly to the importance of international collaboration, of pooling information together, and not being frightened of using novel and different techniques and being able to explore them. So thank you for introducing that for us. I think what I'd like to do is just come back to Alan for a second. If I could just ask you about the second priority, to accelerate the clinical trials and see how this is being addressed. I understand that there is another collaborative research network which is there as well.
Yeah, well, Giancarlo has mentioned that we're coming up with a lot of potential candidates for treatment, and the question always is, how can we determine quickly if they're actually going to be successful or not? And in relapsing remitting MS, when we developed a biomarker that could give us an answer quickly, it transformed the area and it speeded up the study. So I think we don't have a biomarker like that in progressive MS, and this is the aim of this second network. It's Doug Arnold, who is an expert in imaging based in Montreal. But again, as you mentioned earlier, this is an international collaborative group. Canada, United States, United Kingdom, and many other countries are involved. And what they're doing basically is really trying to identify new imaging biomarkers that will predict what's going to happen in progressive MS, that will identify how interventions might actually be successful. It's very challenging, but it's very important. And what they've managed to do is get a huge data set together, I think something around 50,000 images so far from different studies around the world. And now they need to analyze them, and they need to use a whole range of techniques, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. But this is the work in progress, and it is really exciting. That's one aspect, I think. The other area in terms of speeding up trials is something that's been done successfully here in the United Kingdom, which is really looking at 3 or 4 agents at the same time. So you're not doing one and then doing another. And this is another approach, our trial design, that we need to be looking at. So these are 2 big areas of development.
So that is really useful, really helpful in taking us to a point of understanding what's going on here. I was interested in your comments there on adaptive trial design and how that's working. So I think that's really strong. But Professor Freeman, I'd just like to come to you. If I could ask you about the final priority of the Progressive MS Alliance, that is enhancing well-being. This is an area where many of us affected by progressive MS are looking for answers. Simply, what can I do to live my best life? What impact do you think the MS Alliance is having in this area at the moment? Where are the key points we're taking things forward?
Well, the Progressive MS Alliance provided a fantastic opportunity last May in 2018, where it enabled over 200 researchers and people with MS and their carers to all come into one room. There were representatives from 16 different countries, all sharing their expertise and knowledge and experience about living with progressive MS, but how clinicians and researchers can begin to tackle some of the areas that are problematic. And people at this conference provided their different approaches to restoring function, but also to look at brain rewiring and how changes can be made with respect to that in terms of improving MS symptoms. And importantly, we learnt from people studying in other areas, because sometimes you can have great insights from listening to people who are researching in other neurological conditions as well. We also learned how valuable it can be by having these discussions directly with people with MS, involving them in the involvement of the trials and the designs, etc., so that we can really make sure that what we're doing is targeting the right areas and the things that count. So the Alliance really set the stage, I think, for moving this area of rehabilitation and symptom management forwards in terms of international collaboration, because that's something that hasn't really been part of our way of thinking really up until now.
Sure, thank you. I really hear that, and that bringing together of groups of people into one room, which unfortunately is something we've not been particularly good at, I think, historically, and that's not just an MS thing, that's a medicine thing generally. But rehabilitation is your area of expertise and research. And it would be good if you could outline the work that you're currently doing and how you see that helping people like myself living with long-term deterioration with MS. How it's going to enhance our lives.
Okay, so I think the most important thing to think is that just because you're living with a progressive condition doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do, or things that can help people support in terms of improving your quality of life and improving your function.
Sure.
My research is really focused predominantly in the area of physical rehabilitation, and more particularly in terms of balance and mobility. And it's really shown that interventions such as physiotherapy, occupational therapy can help people improve how you can deal with everyday activities.
Sure.
Only about 1% of your time is spent with health professionals, and so a key part of rehabilitation and people like myself, rehabilitationists, is trying to help educate about the things that can be changed and how you can yourself undertake those changes. So one aspect, for example, is regular exercise. Regular exercise will not only make you feel fitter and stronger, but there's also a wealth of evidence now demonstrating that it can improve mobility, improve mood, and even beginning to think that it may improve cognitive impairment as well. So regular exercise is one example where the evidence is available to really demonstrate improvements. Sedentary activity, and that means actually spending a lot of time sitting down or lying down, is a global problem, not just for people with MS, but for the broader population. But it's even more of a problem for people with MS who maybe have restricted mobility and balance, and means that more reliance on sitting down or being in a wheelchair, for example. And that, of course, makes one more at risk of things like heart conditions, but of increasing weakness, of stiffness of muscles, of spasms, of constipation, of deconditioning. And so looking at simple activities that can reduce sedentary activity is something that's really important from an educational perspective. So we've just completed a study which looked at a simple use of a standing frame in people's homes that they could undertake on a daily basis for about 30 minutes. And that was clearly demonstrated to improve motor function, improve mobility with regard to mobility in bed and getting in on and off the wheelchair, etc. But also it was demonstrated to be cost effective. So that's some really important research, I think, that can help people who may be more mobility impaired. And I think the final area that I'd talk about today is the area of falls, because more than 50% of people with MS fall, and about a third of those are recurrent fallers, and you're twice as more likely to fall if you have progressive MS. And the issue with falls is really that it often reduces people's confidence. It reduces their confidence to get out and about and to participate in daily life, and that in turn can lead to a spiral of deconditioning, really. And so part of the research that I involved in, together with a number of other countries actually, is looking at different interventions that can help improve safe mobility so that people continue to still move about, but while reducing the risk of falls. And again, the nub of that is about education, about being aware of risk factors of falls, while at the same time improving balance and mobility.
Quite. Thank you very much for that. As a recurrent faller, I can completely appreciate that, and I'm really interested in your comments on sedentary life. I heard something recently from a colleague of mine saying that sitting is the new smoking.
Yes.
And
That's right.
whilst we don't choose to sit, we're forced to sit. I really get that as far as being an issue as far as maintaining good health. So well-being, wow, it's such an enormous area, and it's difficult often to look at the different aspects from diet, exercise, maintaining symptoms and addressing mobility. What are the areas do you think the Alliance should focus on now to actually accomplish some big difference and inroads into this?
Okay, well, you're right. It is a very big area and complex and challenging to resolve. One of the areas that the Alliance is working on is forming an international team of experts, 20 people, in terms of sharing their knowledge and experience in order to set research priorities related to this area of symptom management. And the areas that are based really around the things that people with MS tell us that are important to them, but are currently more under-researched and where we're finding challenging in terms of managing clinically. So the areas that the Alliance is going to focus on here are those of pain, of fatigue, cognition and mobility as well. And we have the group of experts that will be meeting over the next year to really define more specifically what are the bigger wins in terms of researching in those areas. Currently there's a really confusing array of messages for clinicians and for people with MS. It's about where they can best invest their energy and time. And so the notion is that we'll have a more of a roadmap really as to where we can invest energy most efficiently.
That's super, because I think one of the most frustrating things is where there isn't that roadmap, there isn't a plan that people can pull off the shelf and use, and to hear that that's being developed is really, really strong and really, really important. So if you're watching this webcast, you know that we offered you an option to ask questions today, and we have received hundreds. And through the conversations we've had today, we've tried to cover as many of these topics as possible in the very limited time we have. But there are two questions that have come across over and over again, and I just wanted to have a quick look at if we could before we finish. So, Alan, I'll come to you if I may. We heard Giancarlo talk about stem cells earlier on, and I think that's something that people really want to understand. Is there any work going on stem cell therapy in MS progression at the moment?
Well, I think stem cells has always been an area of huge interest going back probably decades. Excuse me, we've had quite a number of small studies that have been difficult to evaluate. In the last couple of years, there have been a number of larger studies and also analysis bringing all the studies together. And it's become, the picture has become clearer. I think that stem cell treatment can have a really important role in treating remitting MS, particularly aggressive MS, where there's a lot of inflammation, and we've seen very good results in that. In stark contrast, the studies that have looked at progressive MS have really not shown any convincing benefit in that particular group.
Okay, all right, but we always think about positive results. We always think about research offering us the positives, but sometimes about seeing things that don't work quite as well help us to look in other areas as well.
Yeah, I think it does. It helps us to target, and it particularly helps us to identify where there is real need. And I mean, again, that's part of the raison d'etre of the Alliance, is addressing that need.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And Giancarlo, if I could come back to you, we hear an awful lot about diet and MS. And particularly, it would just be really interesting to understand what are the issues of diet, particularly in progressive MS, and what are the things that we can do?
I'm not surprised that this is one of the most frequent questions that has been received, because this is really what usually the patient, when enter for a consultation, asks me, what about the diet? Because there are many different diets around. And I have to say that there is a very more than logical expectation about diets, because we know that the environment is playing a major role in MS, particularly in the evolution of the disease, in modulating the severity. So we have to pay attention to this aspect. Unfortunately, most of the studies that have been performed until now were being very modest in quality, small in dimension, which is a problem because it doesn't allow us to have any really conclusive view about this point. Well, but there are some key points. For example, vitamin D. Vitamin D has now quite clear evidences, converging evidences, even good studies that have revealed the role of vitamin D as a risk factor for MS, but also as a modulating factor. That's something that we have to consider.
Sure.
And second, there are some converging evidences that some excess in diet of saturated fatty acid, animal fatty acid, they tend to be bad, and vice versa, the unsaturated, that is the vegetable, are much better. That doesn't mean that we have to have an excessive approach in this direction. What I usually tell the patients is try to maintain a good shape. Your shape is telling you about your diet. And in combination with the physical exercise, diet is really a major contribution to this.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And as someone living with MS, diet is something that it's easy for me to take control back over. So this is real good news. Real good news. So there's so much to cover when it comes to progressive MS, and the work of the Alliance, and I know we're only scratching the surface today. However, as we're coming to the end of our time, I just want to hear from each of you about what you want people to hear about the work of the Progressive Alliance, and what are you hopeful about? So I'll start with you, Jenny, if I could do.
So what I'd like people to know is firstly that we're listening to the views of people with MS.
Sure.
That's integral to what we're doing, and that for people with progressive MS, that we're interested in people who have more severe disability as well. I'd like people to know that we are truly trying to collaborate as scientists rather than work independently in order to accelerate our knowledge and what we're doing, in order that we can produce evidence that can be translated into clinical practice, so that in the area of rehabilitation and symptom management, if we can produce the evidence, then we can give clear messages to people to help people with MS live their lives more fully. And my hope is really that we can provide high quality research evidence in order to provide those clear messages across the board.
Super. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. And Giancarlo, if I could come to you again, what do you see as the important issues to get across about the work of the Alliance?
Well, let me say first that I think that the patient must have a much more positive view, even in this phase of the disease, because we are really starting to approach in a very solid manner with the initiative of the Alliance the problem. And I'm very positive when I see how the different best MS centers in the world have really come together in a very positive mood. That's fundamental for science. That's fundamental for science. And the second key message is I think that we need more and more a perfect interaction with the patients. It is very fundamental because from one side, particularly in the progressive phase of the disease, what the patient fears is sometimes, and I have to say frequently, much more than what we can see as physicians. So such an integration is really fundamental, but also is fundamental that the patient is able to be appropriately informed about the condition. Because only if there is a good information of the physician and of the patient, of both, then this type of collaboration may produce the best results.
Great, thank you very much. And Alan, if I could just give you the last word on that, a couple of three take-home messages that you'd like people to put in their top pocket, things that we're going to remember and take from today.
Well, the vision of the Alliance is that this is more than just hope, but it's actually progress towards treatment. And what I'd say to everyone with progressive MS is that they're no longer forgotten. They're now actually centre stage. And there's a huge body of people working towards finding effective treatments for them.
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, what a fabulous time we've had here. And just to conclude, the International Progressive MS Alliance is rallying the worldwide MS community and fueling important research activities to get, as Professor Thompson was just saying there, active treatments to those who need them all around the world, so nobody's left out. The Alliance is inspiring hope and has made real good initial progress. What we need to do now is to see that progress continued so that it enables new treatment discovery. It reduces the time that it takes to get these potential treatments to individuals, and finally that it continues to develop a pathway for these treatments so we get a real good movement through the process, so we end up with progressive treatments for progressive MS. There's never been a better time for such concerted effort and action, and this is the time we've got to use. But make no mistake, it's a big job. It's not something that these guys can do on their own. It's for all of us. So for those of you listening today, please keep watching these webcasts. Make sure that you get out and about and share the messages to everybody that you're aware of within the MS communities and outside. And when you get home to your local MS groups, please use them, stimulate them, tell them about what's going on, and make sure that you stimulate donations to come in and support the wonderful work that people like our eminent panel are doing today. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you've learned as much from today as I have from our three fabulous contributors.